The Crisis of Empire, 1754 to 1763. Part 1. The Seeds of Conflict. The Crisis of Empire, 1754 to 1763. The roots of the American Revolution were not in Boston or Philadelphia, but in a global war. It began with the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, from 1754 to 1763. This war was a struggle between Britain and France for control of North America, especially the rich and strategic Ohio River Valley. In 1754, a young George Washington led one of the first skirmishes, and the fighting soon spread across the continent. By 1763, Britain won the war. The Treaty of Paris forced France to give up almost all its territories east of the Mississippi River. For the colonists, this was a victory. They no longer faced the threat of French invasion. But ironically, that same victory planted the seeds of revolution. The war had nearly doubled Britain's national debt. To pay the bills, Britain turned to the colonies for money and control. In 1763, the Proclamation Line forbade colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. It was meant to avoid conflicts with native tribes, but to land-hungry colonists, it felt like a betrayal. They had fought in the war and expected new land, not restrictions. Part 2. Taxation without representation, 1764 to 1774. Now came the real spark, taxation without representation. Britain needed money, and Parliament believed the colonies should help pay for their own defense. But the colonists believed only their own elected assemblies had the right to tax them. The first wave of taxes came through the Sugar Act of 1764, and then the infamous Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act required tax stamps on all printed materials, from newspapers to playing cards. This was an internal tax, not on trade, but directly on daily life, and the colonies exploded in protest. The Stamp Act Congress declared that only colonial legislatures could tax colonists. Groups like the Sons of Liberty organized boycotts and even violent protests. Within a year, Britain backed down and repealed the Stamp Act, but then passed the Declaratory Act, claiming full power in all cases whatsoever. That warning went largely unnoticed. In 1767, the Townshend Acts imposed new import taxes on glass, paper, and tea, this time to pay royal officials' salaries, making them loyal to the crown instead of colonial governments. Tensions kept rising. Then came the Boston Massacre in 1770. British soldiers opened fire on protesting colonists, killing 5 men. Patriot leaders like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere used the event as propaganda, portraying the British as brutal oppressors. When the Boston Tea Party followed in 1773, with colonists dumping British tea into the harbor, Parliament struck back hard with the Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. These laws punished Massachusetts by closing Boston Harbor, restricting self-government, and allowing British soldiers to be housed in private homes. Instead of scaring the colonies, the acts united them like never before. Part 3. The Path to Independence, 1774 to 1776. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress. They demanded repeal of the Intolerable Acts and agreed to boycott British goods. They also urged local militias to prepare for possible war. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched to seize colonial weapons in Concord, but met armed resistance at Lexington. A single gunshot, the shot heard round the world, began the American Revolutionary War. The Second Continental Congress met weeks later, creating the Continental Army and appointing George Washington as commander. They even sent an olive branch petition to King George III asking for peace, but the king rejected it and declared the colonies in rebellion. By early 1776, public opinion was shifting toward independence, helped by Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. It argued that a continent should not be ruled by a distant island, and that liberty required separation. Finally, on July 4, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. It proclaimed the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the belief that governments derive power only from the consent of the governed. Part 4. The War for Independence, 1776 to 1783. The Revolutionary War unfolded in three main phases. First, the Northern Campaign. Britain captured New York City in 1776, forcing Washington into retreat. But he struck back, crossing the Delaware River on Christmas night to win victories at Trenton and Princeton. The turning point came at Saratoga in 1777, where American forces forced a major British surrender. This victory convinced France to join the war as America's ally, followed later by Spain and the Netherlands. At Valley Forge, during the winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington's army suffered terribly, but emerged stronger under the training of Baron von Steuben and Marquis de Lafayette. Second, the Southern Campaign. The British captured Savannah and Charleston, but were worn down by guerrilla tactics led by Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and by General Nathanael Greene's strategic retreat. These efforts weakened the British Army and led to their final stand at Yorktown, Virginia, in 1781. There, Washington and the French Navy trapped General Cornwallis, forcing his surrender. That victory effectively ended the war. Finally, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. The revolution was over, but the next challenge had just begun: building a republic. Part 5. Creating the Republic, 1783 to 1793. After independence, America had to decide how to govern itself. The first system, the Articles of Confederation, created a weak central government. It couldn't tax, regulate trade, or raise an effective army. Economic chaos and rebellions, like Shays' Rebellion in 1786, showed the system wasn't working. So in 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. They created a new framework, the U.S. Constitution, based on federalism, separation of powers, and checks and balances. It also included compromises, such as the Three-Fifths Compromise, which tragically counted enslaved persons as only part of a person for representation. After a fierce national debate, the Constitution was ratified in 1788, followed by the Bill of Rights in 1791. In 1789, George Washington became the nation's first president. Under Alexander Hamilton, the new government assumed war debts, created a national bank, and established a stable financial system. These debates led to the first political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the French Revolution erupted in 1789. As Europe fell into war, Washington chose neutrality in 1793, setting a precedent for future American foreign policy. Conclusion. From 1754 to 1793, the American colonies transformed from loyal subjects of the British Empire into a sovereign republic built on Enlightenment ideals. They fought not only a war for independence, but also for the right to define their own government. By 1793, the United States had survived war, written a constitution, and established its first functioning democracy. Yet unresolved questions about slavery, Native American rights, and the balance of power would continue to shape the nation's future. The revolution, in truth, was not the end, it was the beginning of the American experiment.